Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us today for our virtual connect on restaurant design in a pandemic. My name is Mike Waldinger. I'm the CEO of AIA Colorado. And today we've got a very special panel assembled for you today. I said today twice just to make sure you caught that. This all started with one of our members who reached out early on in this whole shutdown phase, worried about the restaurant clients, worried about how they're going to survive as a result of this and what the profession of architecture can do to help them adapt. And then it continued with a conversation that we had with the Colorado Restaurant Association. For those who don't know, their CEO used to be AIA CEO, Sonia Riggs. So we got a group of architects together who are award-winning architects in the restaurant design space from around the state and came up with a series of recommendations and design solutions that could be responsive to the Colorado Department of Public Health guidelines, in addition to things that are happening in cities as they try and reopen their economies. So that's really why this panel is happening today and what we hope to get out of it. And we hope that you enjoy learning more about it as we look forward to actually being in a restaurant again. Wouldn't that be nice? So without giving too many additional details, because you'll hear directly from the participants in this panel themselves, I do want to remind people that you get 1 hour of HSW credit for attending today. We ask you to stay through to the end. The presentation itself will be done in 4 parts. We have the 3 architects, and then we're really fortunate to have some insight and guidance from a mechanical engineer as well, because that's vitally important to this reopening phase also. If you have questions during the presentation, we will get to them as they come or leave time at the end. So I ask you to use your Q&A function to put those questions in, and we'll get right to it. So our panel today is 4 gentlemen who have a lot of experience, and this is just a fraction of the task force, by the way. There's a much broader group of 12 to 15 individuals who've participated in this, and we thank them for their time, all in a volunteer effort. So I'm going to start in the order that they'll present themselves and ask them to say something for the group to introduce themselves to you. We'll start with Adam Harding. Hi, Adam.
Hi, Mike. Thanks. I'm Adam Harding. I am a partner at Roth Shepherd Architects, and I also am your 2020 president. Yay! Yeah, so half our work at Roth Shepherd is restaurant work. So this is something that I am very close to and that I've been following along through this pandemic. So are we each going to introduce ourselves now, Mike, or are we going to go through?
Yeah, we'll just do that up front and then come back to start with the presentation.
Perfect. Yeah. So that's me.
So next we have Kevin Wynn. Hi, Kevin.
Hey, I'm Kevin Wynn. I'm a sole proprietor with Regular Architecture. Pretty much 80–90% of what I do is restaurants. So I've got a little bit of experience here and helping our clients through this. So.
Thanks, Kevin. Glad you can be here. And we have Frank Mataipula. Hi, Frank.
Yeah. Hey, guys. So you said Frank Mataipula here. You know, I'm with FAM Design right now. And prior to that, I worked in-house with Punchbowl Social as their design director. So we did a bunch of restaurant work there. And then at Oz Architecture, did a lot of work as far as restaurants and a whole gamut of other projects. So, you know, restaurant work is something dear to me. So that's why I initially reached out to try to figure out what's going on. So happy to be here.
Thanks for, you never knew where this was going, but.
I did not know.
Thanks for kicking it off. Be careful what you wish for, because we might say that. And last but certainly not least is Stephen Forrester, our colleague from the mechanical engineering profession. Hi, Stephen.
Hi, how you doing? I'm Stephen Forrester, the principal engineer of DMA Engineering. Yeah, and over the years, we've done a ton of restaurants and all kinds of things associated with food. It's a challenging time for restaurants and what the future looks like for them. So glad to be part of the panel.
Okay, well, that's who you'll be hearing from today. We are going to mute our sound and video while Adam proceeds. So take it away, Adam, and let's get it started.
All right. Next slide, please. So what I'm going to be talking about today is just going over the statewide health guidelines that was put out by the Department of Public Health and Environment. And then I'm going to go into kind of a lot of research that we've done on our side about just the health, safety, and welfare considerations for architects and their clients, and what we should be educating our clients on as we kind of navigate the next several months and potentially a year or year and a half until a vaccine's provided. So with that said, next slide, please. So I just want to start off by saying, restaurants are critical for our public sphere. They are places of hospitality, gatherings, birthdays, and
Oops, Adam, I think we lost sound there temporarily. Got an audio issue, Adam. Stand by.
Can everyone hear me now?
Oh, good. Okay.
Yeah, good. Okay.
The last thing we heard was that restaurants are hospitality, and they're part of bringing people together.
Okay. So they're a critical part of our community. So what I'm going to go over first is just the state guidelines that came out and that all restaurateurs need to follow. These are posted online, so I'm going to go over these quickly and just kind of highlight the major points, but they're easy to find if you just Google search restaurant state guidelines, and this document comes up that you're seeing in front of you. So I'm going to start with the food service space. So restaurants are encouraged to continue their curbside pickup and delivery, and this includes the alcohol pickup and delivery as well, which we've all probably enjoyed over the past couple weeks. They encourage outdoor dine-in service, and part of that is, working with local authorities to get authorization for expanding space to accommodate outdoor dine-in for adjacent or not adjacent public or private spaces. The following requirements must be met. Patrons in different parties must be a minimum of 6 feet apart. The spacing of tables may need to be 6 feet or more to ensure proper physical distancing between diners from different parties. All employees must wear face coverings, and disinfecting and deep cleaning of all shared surfaces between seating is required. So for the indoor dine-in services, that could be held at either 50% of the posted occupancy code limit and a maximum of 50 patrons. So if the following requirements can be met. So patrons in different parties must be a minimum of 6 feet apart. The space of tables may need to be 6 feet or more to ensure proper physical distancing between diners from different parties. All employees must wear face coverings. They must ensure maximum ventilation by opening windows and minimizing air conditioning to the extent possible. Deep clean and disinfect all shared surfaces between parties at each turnover, and keep parties together and do not allow them to mingle with each other. And the limit party size is 8 people or fewer. And then if you go to the next slide, please. No, back one more, sorry. Yeah, there we go. Making an effort to reduce congregating inside and outside of establishments, including encouraging reservations, and preferably require reservations if feasible. Waiting parties must not congregate in entrance areas and should wait in their cars or off-premise until seating is available. There's no communal seating, no self-service stations or buffets, no seat yourself options to ensure that a table has been disinfected prior to a new patron. Do not seat people in the bar if it's being used to prepare food or drink. If the bar area is not being used to prepare food or drink, parties could sit there under the same distance requirements as regular tables, and clearly mark floor and ground to delineate 6-foot spacing for people in lines, and mark how foot traffic should move. Clearly mark closed tables not available for seating customers as well. So posting clear signs, notifying patrons and employees of hygiene and sanitation expectations, including not entering if they or anyone in their household is experiencing any symptoms of illness. Minimize objects touched by multiple patrons, including the removal or close of games and dance floors that require or encourage standing around. So that means darts, pool tables, shuffleboards, arcade games, and the removal of board games that we used to see. And discontinue use of tablecloths, or you might move to a single use or remove and replace laundered tablecloths between patrons. And then there's the disinfectant of any shared objects such as check presenters and POS machines, cleaning those thoroughly between uses, increase cleaning and disinfection protocols and track with publicly posted cleaning logs. This should include disposable single-use menus, menu boards, or create an online menu for guests to review from their electronic devices. Provide single-use or single-serving condiments, disinfect restrooms every hour, block off stalls and urinals with proper signage to support the 6 feet between patrons. And this may require reduced bathroom capacity or even only one person in a bathroom at a time. And then provide hand sanitizers at the check-in area and throughout the venue. And then if we start talking about employees, the guidelines talk about implementing symptom monitoring protocols, including workplace temperature monitoring and symptom screening questions. Appoint 1 employee per shift to monitor staff and public for adherence to safety measures. Require employees to stay home and refer to employer or state support where showing any symptoms or sign of sickness. Provide guidance, training and ongoing training on maintaining the 6-foot distancing between employees to the greatest extent possible in all areas of operations. Implement systems to minimize staff interactions such as workflow, shift cohorting, same staff on each shift, staggering of shifts, shift changes and breaks. Require employees to wear face coverings while in the establishment. Require facial coverings for vendors, suppliers, and contract workers entering the licensed establishment. Require gloves or frequent hand washing. Encourage frequent breaks to wash hands at least every 30 minutes, including upon arrival and departure. And adhere strictly to the hygiene practices listed in the Colorado retail food regulations, including not working when sick, frequent hand washing, changing gloves between tasks, and using a fresh pair of gloves after each hand washing. And then consider modifying the menu to create additional space in the kitchen and promote physical distancing, and implement physical distancing where it's practical. We all know that kitchens are tight spaces. And then all staff meetings must follow physical distancing as well. Consider virtual meetings or meetings outside with appropriate distancing, and require employees to take home all belongings, including water bottles after every shift, and provide high quality face coverings for employees as much as possible. And then to protect the customers, providing an option for customers to sign in to facilitate notifying them if an exposure occurs, provide contactless payment or prepayment options wherever possible, establish customer waiting areas outdoors if possible that maintain proper physical distancing from each other, and restrict standards and or congregating in the bar area, entrance, exit areas, and any interior spaces, and continue curbside pickup delivery options and recommend them for vulnerable individuals. And then request customers to wear face coverings when not eating and drinking, walking past other tables to get to delivery areas or restrooms. Consider refusing service to customers who refuse to adhere to hygiene and physical distancing requirements, and make accommodations for individuals unable to adhere to masking and physical distancing requirements such as takeout, curbside, or delivery. So those are all just
was the HVAC system on where you were at?
Say that again.
Probably, I don't know. When the big doors were open.
Hey, Steve, I think you're unmuted.
Yep. Sorry about that, guys.
Sorry. Megan, can you go to the next slide, please? So all of this information's online. I just want to give a quick summary. It's easy to follow. Now I want to kind of get into the design part of it and how architects can start to implement these or how they can start to guide their clients in terms of the spaces that we occupy. And so what we're looking at here on the screen is just your typical restaurant kind of zones. You have your loading zone. That's where typically the back of house and where food comes in. You have your kitchen zone, and then you have your public zone. And so you start to think about all these different areas where different people are activating the space and the different touch points that not only the front of house has, but the back of house as well. And so if you go to the next slide, please. So what we need to do as architects and designers is really to start to think about those interactions and the cross-contamination that happens with people interacting in such a public space. And so in order for people to want to come back to restaurants, there needs to be a rebuilding of trust. And in order to do that, restaurateurs need to send a message to their customers that their restaurant is a haven from what's outside. And so you start to thinking about the sequence of spaces and the limit of droplets spread throughout a space. So evaluating the new food safety and sanitation protocols as spatial challenges. So thinking about how employees should enter the facility through a designated entry separate from the guests, and how temperature should be checked and logged upon arrival, and how you start to implement or find a space in the back of house for changing and storage areas, provided that there's space for employees to don on and their PPE and clean attire for the day, and wherever possible, distinguish between service and return doors and hallways to exchange zones to limit contamination. So, you know, you think about how the food comes into the space, how that food is broken down from the boxes and then brought into the kitchen. And it's really trying to limit the amount of cross-contamination between these different zones in a restaurant. So mitigation of droplets through surfaces. So the CDC understands that contaminated high-touch surfaces may be a transmission route for COVID-19. In a food establishment, that means doors, doorknobs, linens, chairs, countertops, dispensers, toilets, and sinks are examples of high-touch surfaces. And so materials and surfaces should be deployed and installed to minimize or eliminate touching, to make touch points obvious, and with the understanding that they must be frequently cleaned and disinfected. And then the control of airborne infection. And so I'm not going to touch too much on this because Stephen's going to talk about the HVAC as well, but it's something to consider and to educate your restaurant or your clients on as well. And then you need to examine the spaces of your restaurant with the flexible reconfiguration in mind. So as a baseline, each restaurant should designate exchange zones to control delivery, customer handoff, the don on and don off procedures for their employees, ventilated storage and cooking, and disposal of contaminated materials. So boxes that come in the back, you know, how do those get disposed of in a safe way? And then provide space for your employees to don on and don off their PPE and their clean clothes, installing hand washing basins for guests to use upon entering the space. I think this is something that it's going to be this kind of ritual of going to a restaurant. It's going to, hopefully this is something that just sticks with us, because everyone should be washing their hands before they eat a meal. And then making sure that, you know, we talked about that with the state guidelines, posting visible safety standards and protocols for both the guest and employees. Once again, it's this level of care that restaurateurs need to show their customers so that their customers feel safe to come into it. The more care that a restaurateur shows and the best practices that they're visibly showing to people is going to make people more comfortable to come into that space and eat. So in terms of the guest experience, you know, the guest should enter from the main entrance at the time of their reservation. There should be a concierge position for check-in and direct guests to a wash basin prior to being seated. You kind of think of, you know, the traditional Japanese hot towel oshibori that you have at a nice Japanese restaurant. It's a similar thing. It's a similar concept, you know, before you sit down for a meal, wash your hands. Tables should be positioned 6 feet apart, and like I said, outdoor seating is preferable. And then you have the ordering systems shall be minimized for the use of surface such as menus and touchscreens. And then having guests leaving with takeout shall be instructed with the proper handling of their food as well. We talked about front of house staff taking temperatures, designating staff restrooms should be used to prevent cross-contamination. Runners should deliver food through a designated delivery doorway separate from the door servicing the dirty dishes. And employees should maintain an appropriate 3-foot distance while passing tables with food. And then, you know, managing the disposal of food and just stuff that's on the table with clear instructions to your staff. Same with the back of house, how things get brought into the space, how that gets broken down, how that goes to the kitchen. It's all about minimizing the cross-contamination that happens through the space, and really thinking about all of the different touch points that not only your guests are going to have, but also the employees have during that time. So it's really about, once again, it's providing clear signage, it's providing your customers with a clear perspective that they're taking this seriously and that they're following the rules and regulations, and that the space is clean. It's a visual understanding. It's, you know, expanding into the streets is something that we're going to talk about today as well. So I'm not going to go into that very much, but it's really about designing for trust. And so it's beyond stopping the pathogens. Food establishments must support the people. Employees must be supported through a safe and trusted and clear working condition. Guests may be dissuaded from entering the dining space if they seem like it's unsafe or they feel uncomfortable. And that visual grade signage posted on restaurants to provide that trust in the standard and the monitoring of the compliance with the state regulations is going to be important. So that's kind of high level, but once again, thinking about the cross contaminations from the back of house all the way to the front of house and vice versa is something that we need to educate our clients on, and those touch points that happen throughout the space, and how do you minimize those and create that level of trust for everyone. So that's what I got.
Thanks, Adam. Really appreciate that comprehensive overview of the state requirements. And before we move to the outdoor and some of the more local adaptations of those state guidelines, have we heard much about a next phase for the state? Like, are they going to stay at the 50% or 50% occupancy, or are they going to, you know, open up even further?
Yeah, they haven't come out with anything new on that. I think it's just they're trying to figure it out as they go. You know, restaurants were able to open last Wednesday, I believe was the, or was it? I believe it was last Wednesday. And so slowly, I think we're starting to see more and more open. I think there's planned by, you know, honestly, I think the 6 feet apart and the occupancy limit is something that's going to be here to stay for the future until a vaccine's established and distributed. Eventually things will go back to normal once a vaccine is provided, but I think these precautions are going to have to stay in place for the foreseeable future. I hope some of these best practices about really thinking about, you know, sanitation, hand washing, cleaning of spaces, and that cross-contamination is something that I hope doesn't go away. I think it's just good best practices that need to take into account for public spaces. And so we'll just have to see what happens.
I appreciated what you said about the restaurant being a safe haven and conveying that people are cared for when they're in the space, not just the patrons, but the employees too. And I know as restaurant designers, you're all mindful of the kind of experience people have, and the safety was just presumed. You didn't have to program elements of the design to convey safety, but that's something new that probably should be considered by people who design these spaces.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Adam. We'll get back with Q&A and more discussion later. And now we're going to hear from Kevin. So take it away, Kevin.
Next slide. Thanks, Adam. I think, the biggest thing that we're talking about, I'm going to kind of hit on what some of our local jurisdictions are letting us do as far as eating outside in places we weren't allowed to eat outside before. Got a couple of slides here. If we can go to the next one. Next slide, please. This is a presentation that was provided by the city of Denver, who were sort of the front runners in what, at least in Colorado, it could look like to sit outside. And they sort of, even before Polis allowed us to have in-person dining again, released these guidelines that created a permit process for people in Denver to get a little bit more seating. So, what could be allowed? They're allowing for expansions into parking lots and streets and sidewalks. And they're not really putting a whole lot of restrictions on that as long as you're doing it responsibly. You're allowed to do sit-down dining, customer pickup, carry out. They're trying to limit the amount of permanent structures that you're building. Obviously, those will require an additional zoning permit, so they don't want you to head down that path. And just like a lot of what Adam was talking about, we're still not going to be allowed to have, live entertainment, games, standing areas. The sound was one that came up a lot in question, and it's really just adding sound to a place that didn't have sound before was the big question there. Go to the next slide. And as far as eligibility goes, it's basically any place that operates kind of like a restaurant. So they call out brew pubs and breweries and microbreweries, which are going to be required to have some sort of food component similar to the food trucks they would have sitting outside right now. And they would have to operate a little bit more like a restaurant, hitting back on some of the things Adam talked about, to where we're talking about pre-reserved seating areas. Ideally, reservations are paying for their food ahead of time, less contact, things like that. And then they're not allowing food trucks to add space to the space they didn't have before. They're saying food trucks are going to operate as they had before, and they can just continue to do what they were going to do. Next slide. This was the one that was, hours of operation seemed important. Existing patios are allowed to keep doing whatever they were doing. And they actually are allowing you to go a little bit later than 10 p.m. right now, depending on where you are, as long as you're not in a residential neighborhood, basically. And these guidelines are going to allow you to go through September 7th, with the possibility of an extension depending on how things are going come September. So, it's going to start being the cold season, so they're thinking that outside dining may not be as much of a relevant solution. If you can go to the next slide, this is sort of what we, as part of our task force, was working on. Kaylin, who was a member of the group, put a bunch of these diagrams together, and I think they're really good to show some of our restaurant clients that have, this one starts off with a big parking area, but just to show them with social distancing, the 6 foot between people, basically, how many seats you could get depending on how much parking you took over. If we can go to the next slide, another sort of version of that, to where you can get more, 4 tops versus 2 tops and situations like that. And then the next slide, if we can see that, talks about parallel parking, which I think is probably a more common situation that's happening with our restaurants, and especially in the downtown area. And the city's allowing us to both look at taking over parallel parking spaces, taking over some sidewalk area, and potentially shutting down roads. I know I'm working with one restaurant in the Wash Park area that's actually working with 4 other restaurants that are close to them to close down the road in front of them and separate it out in ways so they can all get a little bit of seating. that's sort of the general guidelines that Denver was talking about. And I think it's important to understand that it's sort of the same guidelines that we're talking about inside, but they're outside. And the recommendation right now is that outside seating is going to generally be a little bit more safe for eating, just because of the ventilation issues and the movement of air. So a lot of the restaurateurs I've been talking to are trying to figure out ways to maximize this outside space. And I've had, the next piece I want to talk about is I've had the opportunity to sort of experience the application process a little bit. And, in Denver, they've actually made it relatively streamlined. There's an initial submittal, and you can find it on Google just if you search Denver temporary outdoor expansions. And all they require for the initial submittal is a site plan and your business ownership information. So if you're helping out the restaurant, all they want to know is what the actual business name is, and if they're a DBA or whatever, and then they want to see a site plan. And in talking to the city for this site plan, what you really need to be putting together is something, as they said it, not me, a preschooler could understand. They just really want their inspectors to be able to go out on site and totally understand what you're doing. And the things they're focusing on is where you're trying to add seats, if you're trying to do it in the right of way, if you're trying to do it in, to shut down a street, if you're trying to extend into a parking lot, they want to see where those areas are. And ideally what they want to see is how you intend to expand your liquor license boundary. And then definitely notate exactly where you're planning on encroaching on the right of way. That initial submittal is really straightforward. It's like 4 lines on their website, and you submit it, you get an email almost immediately saying, we've received your application. And it actually, I submitted one about a week and a half ago when this first went live, and it took them almost a whole week to get back to me with the second response. I submitted another one on Thursday of last week, and they responded the next day. So it seems like things are moving a little quicker. Once you get that initial response back, you basically have to submit for a right-of-way submittal through the ePermits website, and they give you a great guideline with basically step-by-step instructions on how to take care of that. It's a $150 submittal fee, and that process seems to be going really quickly. The right-of-way contacted me within 24 hours to say yes or no, or ask some questions about the progress. And then once right-of-way approves it, you'll basically get an inspection card, just like if you're going for, building permit you'd have hanging on the door. And you're required to get inspections. You have to call 311 and do all that, just like the contractor would, but you have to get inspections from fire, building, excise and license, and public health. Once all of those are approved, the city will give you both a city and a state permit upon approval that basically allows you to operate in that new patio area. It gets a little bit more complex if you're shutting down a road, as you would expect, but overall, it's been a very straightforward process, and the people within the city of Denver have been incredibly helpful along the way. I've even gotten a few cell phone numbers, which is a little bit shocking, in that they're willing to help, and they want restaurants to get open back up and as full as they can be. In Boulder, I haven't had the opportunity to go all the way through the process, but they have a similar submittal set up. But their initial submittal is a little bit more complex in that they ask a lot more questions, and they lay out a lot more requirements. Things like they want to know if you're going to try and add additional lighting. They want to see how you're going to add the boundaries to the liquor license area immediately on your site plan. And then if you're a tenant within a space, they need a letter from your landlord saying that your landlord's going to let you take over the space on the right of way. Denver didn't ask for that. And then your business owner information. My discussions with Boulder made it sound like once all of that's submitted, they basically will set up an inspection, and it's a single inspection. They'll have somebody come out and take a look at it, and after that time, you're basically headed towards approval. So, that's sort of what the submittal process looks like in Boulder and Denver. I know some of the restaurants I'm working with have went ahead and started the process on their own, and they're sort of able to take over. Definitely been answering some questions here and there, but for the most part, the city's not requiring full-on drawings. So even from our perspectives, if it's something that you're helping out with, we're not putting together a site plan submittal for zoning. So understand that, you can get away with a little bit simpler of a project to help out on the fees a little bit. So you're not spending 10 hours, you can do it in a couple. And then, I just want to kind of talk about how some of the restaurants I'm working with are seeing this. I've got some restaurants that are seeing the patio expansions as an expansion of their existing dining room, adding seats and trying to get back up to that 100% of what they were before. And some are even trying to get, up to 120 and trying to salvage a little bit of what they lost in the past few months. I've got two clients though that are looking at things a little bit differently. One of them is basically trying to get the street closure at all and use parking lots at all of their facilities and do all of their dining outside. They're thinking that the outside dining is where people are going to feel more safe, and their interiors are pretty small and tight anyway. So they don't want to bring people inside, and they're going to use that primarily as they have been for the to-go process, which is taking up the majority of their dining room with all the boxes and packaging and everything and getting the logistics sorted. So they're basically applying for these permits in hopes that everyone can sit outside and it's going to be what they do for the next 3 or 4 months. The other client that's sort of bucking the trend a little bit is they're planning to use their outsourced seating entirely. They're only booking tables on the outside seating, and they have about the same number of outside seats as they would have inside at the 50% number. Their worry is that at a weather event, they've got people reserved for tables outside and they can't come and eat. Or they're sitting down halfway through their meal and they've got nowhere to take them. So they're basically keeping empty tables open on the inside. And when people come for a reservation, they're seating everybody outside and leaving empty tables just for the event that potentially something happens. They can put them somewhere. Some restaurants are saying, if it rains, you're sort of SOL, we'll put your stuff in a box and you can go home. So it's going to be a little bit of a learning process, I think, across the board for everybody. But, at least Denver and Boulder are making it pretty easy for our restaurants to get some additional seating outside to help them get back up to that 100% capacity. So yeah, that's about all I had.
Thanks, Kevin. So these go through, I think, September. Is that right? It's not a forever change.
Yeah, it's currently September 7th is the date that both jurisdictions are calling out. Okay. But there's a potential that it could expand.
Mm-hmm. And on the outside areas that aren't in the public right of way, is there any proof of ownership or access to that space that's required?
So in Boulder, they are requiring you, they're asking you to provide a letter from your landlord basically saying, yes, it's okay if they use this space, which is making my submittals up there a little bit more complicated. In Denver, they just sort of ask you a question, is this abutting to your lease space? And if it is, then you can go ahead and use it. One of the spaces I'm working on is actually in sort of a strip, and we're taking over the space in front of the retail shop next to us as well. And they just really wanted to know that the owner was okay with it. They didn't ask for any paperwork or anything.
Okay. Are you seeing anything where those adjacent spaces have perhaps one use during the day and an outdoor dining space in the evening?
I haven't encountered that yet. Just, in talking to the right-of-way on the phone, they seem incredibly flexible. She basically told me, I've got one sort of outstanding permit that I haven't heard back from them on. And speaking with them on the phone, they basically said they're not really denying anything right now, as long as you're coming in with something that seems reasonable. So,
okay.
Just reasonable is a fixed, a loaded term, but that's what they told us.
One thing you've touched on that I want to highlight is that there's also the street closure option.
Yeah.
Not necessarily something that the operator and their design partner would ask for, but perhaps something that the street or the community might designate, which is something more common if there's a weekend festival, for example, but they may be more flexible on allowing those on a more permanent basis during this until September timeframe.
Yep.
So that's, if you have clients that are struggling for ways to increase their capacity, that might be a tool in the toolbox to talk to them about.
Yeah, and the one restaurateur I have that is looking at the street closure permit, they are the street they're looking at closing is actually one of the ones that was one of the designated bike lanes during everything that was closed. So it's actually, that seems to be helping them in the process.
Okay, thanks, Kevin. We're
Yeah.
gonna go now to Frank.
Hey, right. So I'm going to talk a little bit about best practices with existing spaces, kind of figuring out some of that interior seating and figuring out what kind of options there are and some of the approach of what we've done to get there. So to reiterate, I think flexibility is really what's key when it comes to, dealing with what we're going through right now with restaurants and restaurant reopenings. And that we need to acknowledge that all restaurants are not the same. And I think that was one of the biggest struggles that we had, with coming up with ideas, not knowing exactly what the guidelines were initially. So it was really figuring out how to adapt this to a lot of different restaurant spaces. So, and one thing that we do understand is that, with the current rule of 50% maximum occupancy or 50 maximum occupants, this isn't really a viable option for restaurants for a long-term solution. For them to thrive and stay in business, you have to be at that maximum capacity. So kind of going back to, what Kevin talked about for outdoor seating is really a great solution for a lot of restaurants. If you can go to the next slide for the interior diagram. Okay. So this little interior diagram is something that we came across early on when we started this task force, and it really helped to guide our discussion as far as, what options and what exactly can we do for social distancing related to a modified interior layout. Also having these diagrams available are good for designers to also have that visual key, and also for restaurant operators to use. I think when you have this kind of map essentially of what is allowable, you have this list of guidelines, and when you have it spelled out with a diagram, this is usually the better way to really understand exactly what the city is requiring you to do to be open, to stay open, to operate safely. And then one thing I did want to talk about briefly is, there is a whole option for physical distancing versus social distancing, exactly what those terms mean. And we've opted to kind of go down that route of physical distancing when we took the approach of doing out some of these interior layout options. And, it's hard, when you're trying to do working towards the health and safety of guests and staff, we have to look at ways to maintain that social level, so we kind of work towards physical distancing as what that is, because you want to maintain, why you go to a restaurant. You want to keep sightlines open to other tables, open to that visual connection to other patrons, and the activity of the kitchen and waitstaff is really important. And, seeing that activity from the waitstaff and kitchen, kind of lends toward that whole safety factor that we've talked about. It kind of builds that trust with people when they see exactly what you are doing as a restaurant operator, to see, how things are going, what you're doing for safety, just having those visual cues within the space. And then continuing to communicate the vision of the restaurant's concept is one of the struggles that we're having with, physical distancing within an interior layout. So you don't want to lose exactly what that restaurant's about. So coming up with ideas on exactly how to keep that going is really important as well. For example, one of the projects that we are helping out on is, the whole concept is based on social interaction and the social environment. So, as mentioned, restaurants are a critical part of our public sphere. The question then is, how do we in other restaurants maintain that without risking the spread of the virus? So it's, again, coming up with some creative solutions on maintaining why you go to a restaurant to begin with, but also staying safe for staff and patrons. And just, the mere fact that, people want the opportunity to go out with other people and have fun and friends, and, family, and, enjoy yourself and be in that social environment. So, but going back to this diagram, when we approached it as well, we've tried to focus on 3 different aspects. There's the, you kind of have to take the approach of really focusing on the revised operations of the kitchen and staff related to reopening. Whether that's a smaller drink and food menu option, exactly what that route for servers are within the space, then we would work with operations regarding any different circulation waitstaff would have serving patrons and pushing for standardized traffic patterns. Coming up with these standardized traffic aisles that you can see in the diagram here, really help to establish exactly where are servers and going throughout the space to serve patrons, and then what can we do to fill in those spaces. So then third, keeping those areas that would work best for customer seating highlighted, and then provide a revised layout of tables. You can see in this diagram that, they're showing about a 12 to 16 foot circulation aisle, which we all know is not really feasible in many restaurants. So it's just maintaining that idea from Colorado state guidelines of what exactly is for physical distancing to keep your patrons safe and your staff safe. And with that, we've kind of focused exactly on keeping, say, one single server traffic pattern where we could, provide alternate routes to restrooms and to minimize crossing paths and exactly what those exposure times are. And then other aspects of this, you can see, when it comes to table layouts, keeping in mind the 6 foot distance rule, that's your minimum. Keep 6 foot distance away from patrons from table to table, no crossing of different parties, keeping everything you can to keep everyone safe. We found that, when you are removing tables from an existing space, you want to attempt to stagger those tables within there, and kind of gives a little bit more of a better feel, and to kind of give it a little bit more of an occupied sense as well. And if your restaurant is removing tables, if you're not removing tables, excuse me, make it visibly clear which table is not in service. And then those tables can act as actual barriers from actual occupied tables. So it helps to kind of give that visual cue again that, the operator is really paying attention of what that space is and exactly how far apart you should be from other people. And one interesting thing I read based on restaurants that don't remove tables, an uncrowded restaurant can be inviting and a vacated one may be disconcerting. So, depending on what that restaurant space is, it's kind of nice to actually have some of the furniture still there and not just have a sea of vacant area and distant tables. Another aspect of the space is if you do have an area like a large private dining room, moving those tables towards the perimeter of the space so that staff can pivot. So you can see in that bottom right area of that diagram, an example of a private dining room. Staff can go in, service tables, you're kind of in the center of the space and you can pivot to each area. So you can have the option of not really getting too close when you're working with patrons there, and then just really maneuvering the best you can. And then another aspect that we're really taking is, we have a lot of options in some restaurants where you have operable openings, say operable overhead garage doors, storefront openings. We've taken the approach to just move the tables out to those openings. It provides a little bit more of that indoor-outdoor atmosphere. It helps kind of give that more communal feel without actually being, 2 feet away from someone. And it just helps give that sense of being out there and having that more outdoor feel as well. So we're really taking advantage of that. And then, I think we'll have a really run for some umbrellas here soon as we kind of work towards some outdoor seating options to really provide some shading. So the other aspect here, if you look at the diagram, is really addressing booths and banquettes. Again, the 6 foot distance rule stays in place. For fixed booths, you want to follow the, every other booth seating option as shown on the left side of this diagram. So having parties in every other booth is important to really maintain exactly that spacing as well. If the booths are not fixed, we found that removing some of those temporarily if you can, and putting those in storage and replacing with some of the loose tables in your restaurant could provide a little bit more seating capability at that 6 foot separation. And then one note to really focus on here in this diagram, they show a screen on this center banquette. So there's a screen shown to help, provide a little bit more of a safety barrier, if you will, between guests. I'll talk about that a little bit further down in the presentation, but that is an option that's been thrown out a bit, but maybe not the best option when it comes to not spreading the virus. And then when it comes to bars, for Denver, bars can be occupied by patrons if they're not being used for the preparation of food or drink. So if you're not using that area for service, food, drink prep, then guests can sit there at the same 6-foot distancing rules. You know, at some of the restaurants that we're helping out, you know, we have a couple of different bars that work through. So, you know, working through one of those bars, if it is an optional seating area, works out well. But, you know, I think we've also found that sitting at certain bar layouts, if it is a seating option, isn't really the most inviting aspect either, with your back to, you know, some of the dining areas. So it's not really an option that we've pursued too much, but, you know, I think for restaurants, removing a bar is not really an option. So it's, you know, figuring out exactly what works best for your seating. So if that bar is something that you don't need to use for, you know, food prep or drink, then that isn't a total viable option to have more seats available. And then to address again, the screen that was shown in the center of those two banquettes, it was a question brought on early on regarding, you know, barriers to increase occupancy. So, you know, we've asked that question a couple of times, and what it came out down to was feedback from public health is that barriers will not be an allowable substitution for established minimum social distancing as discussed. So, you know, if you do have this type of scenario where you have some seating back to back, you know, if it is a partition that possibly goes all the way up to structure, that might be something that is a feasible solution. But right now, barriers between tables, just to get them closer together, is not really something that would work too well for complying with the rules, unfortunately. And then one thing that we tried to focus on as well is, you know, avoiding tables in certain areas. You know, in this diagram, you can see some of the little areas that are highlighted in red. So eliminate tables at entries and exits, you know, just to provide a little bit more space for people entering and exiting, for the host, just so they have a little bit more space and more of a path to really circulate. You know, that host might become a little bit more of the concierge that Adam talked about, that really is addressing, you know, people that have a reservation, they're waiting outside. So this host is really kind of going to be really working on some traffic control in my mind. And then, you know, as far as other layout options within restaurants, you know, going back to Kevin's point on outdoor seating, and really to reiterate that if you have the option for outdoor seating to maximize your seating area, you know, I would really consider pursuing that. You know, the process is, can be simple, as Kevin mentioned. So, you know, it's something to really consider. And then to kind of wrap up a little bit, you know, we find, and when we've done a little bit of research, you know, the demand for going back into a restaurant really is there. So we really need to be safe in figuring out exactly how we do that. You know, figuring out exactly what works for outdoor seating areas, indoor seating. You know, as Adam mentioned, I really don't see this distancing going away for a little while. And I'm sure we're in a little bit of a wait and see period with the state to see exactly how this performs and what might happen within spreading the virus if something does happen again. But, you know, when it comes to it, a lot of these generations that are coming to restaurants and, you know, working on punchbowl socials in the past, you know, millennials and Gen Z won't substantially change any of this as they come out of it. So, you know, that desire to be in social scenarios is still there. And it's, you know, you can see it driving around Denver now as restaurants open. Some of these patios are pretty full. And, you know, if they're not really following 6-foot distancing, I'm not sure. But, you know, the desire to be out there really is there. So that's all I have right now for, you know, kind of addressing some existing spaces.
Thanks, Frank. That was great. They say a picture's worth 1,000 words, but if you didn't give us your words to explain the same, we would have the wrong 1,000 applied to it. So a great walkthrough. Really appreciate that. I know one concern we heard early on from the Restaurant Association on behalf of the operators is they were grateful for our offer to help assist them, but also want us to be very mindful that their economics have changed greatly. So it's not a case of them being able to do any physical improvements or capital projects of any kind. So are you hearing that not just on the outdoor space, but especially on the indoor spaces as well?
It is. You know, we've reached out to a few past clients to see how things are going. And, you know, it's just working on that razor thin margin at this point. You know, if they were doing delivery service or takeout service is one thing, but, you know, operating at this low occupancy has really hurt their business a ton. So, what we can do to really help them, no matter what, is, kind of the best option. So that's, we've heard this time and time again with the ones we've reached out to, that they're hurting. It's a hurting industry, among many others. So, trying to figure out what those best options are and really getting creative and crafty is probably the best way to go about it.
One other note too is anything that does get installed in the space, whether it be a divider or something else, that's another surface to clean. So even if you can come by it cheaply and quickly, it does incur some operating expenses and differences in how you operate that space. We've got some questions from the audience, but before we get to those, and they're all terrific, I do want to make sure we hear from some of the ventilation considerations, because that's probably your most likely source of contaminants. And so we're going to go now to Stephen to share some of his insight. Thanks, Stephen.
Yep. So yeah, the kitchen, the HVAC stuff, it's been mentioned. Most restaurants are just trying to get open, see what the new world looks like. They operate on a thin margin. So what is the HVAC system going to look like for kitchens? There is some guidelines. If we want to go to the next slide. So the CDC, OSHA, Denver, and also ASHRAE has put together their own recommendations on the systems. And one is to bring in as much outdoor air as possible through natural ventilation. So the big patio doors, keep those open, open all operable windows. So, a lot of restaurants now want to bring that indoor-outdoor feel. So we can do that in a lot of restaurants. Some restaurants, we're not going to be able to do that. They're in a smaller space with a smaller front opening and a bigger dining area. So that's going to be a challenge in some areas. So mechanical ventilation will be a problem once we get into that. Next slide, please. So in the front of the house, you're going to want to run your air conditioner. Fan should run continuous even after hours. We want to get we want to keep that air. So if we're going to move the air, the idea is let's move it, get it circulated, and then run it through a filter or better. So most AC units right now are running like a MERV 8, MERV 13. So the different MERVs, the higher the MERV, the smaller particle it'll filter down. So a MERV 13 will take down a smaller particle, which they're thinking is, MERV 13, MERV 14 will get most of the virus out of it in it, but they're going to clog up and things like that. The other thing is general exhaust fan to run continuous. So if you're bringing air in, we want to make sure we're taking air out. So we just want to make sure that we're balancing that out. Bath fans, we want your bath fans to run continuous. There's been some evidence that the stuff can happen in the bathroom area, and then when you flush the toilet, it can get aerosoled and put in the environment that way. So that's a consideration there. The kitchen hood to be on in the on position while the kitchen is occupied, even if no cooking is present. Most kitchen hoods, you turn them on, they run at a very low speed until they sense heat, and then as they sense the heat, they'll run faster as there's more heat underneath the hood. But when you're the back of the house, people are there, have the hood on just to be bringing in a little bit of fresh air through there. If present, back of the house, run an air conditioning fan should run continuous even after hours, much like the front of the house. Next slide, please. So install a UVG light in the air handler close to the cooling coil. There's some, ASHRAE doesn't have a full stance on whether the UVG lights do. The CDC recommends it, so ASHRAE has adopted that, and they're putting those in as part of the ASHRAE recommendation per CDC. So that's one thing to consider. Change thermostat set points to have a higher cooling and a lower heating threshold. So we're going to be running more outside air with the fans running continuous, which is going to be more energy. So if we make our thermostat set points just a little higher, especially if we have our patio doors open, our overhead doors are open, and we're running that fan, make our thermostat set points higher for cooling and lower for heating, saves a little energy, and do that. There's evidence that the virus spreads further in dry air. Ideally, humidity should be between 40 and 60%. In our environment, we're bringing in a lot more outside air. If we have big patio doors open, that's going to be a challenge to do with all this open stuff in there. If your restaurant's going to be closed, you may need a humidifier to achieve that range. It just depends on how your place runs and how that humidity is going to be. Typically in our environment, 30% humidity in a very enclosed space is pretty normal. So getting to that 40%, humidification is going to be a thing that we're going to have to consider long term. Another long term is an energy recovery ventilator. Will reduce energy costs and provide better indoor air quality for the front of the house. So the requirements are to bring in more outside air into the space. So if we're bringing it in, we have to condition it, and then we have to exhaust air out. But if we can use some type of heat exchange, like an ERV, which is a full energy recovery ventilator, so it'll work on the humidity as well. So it helps out on the humidity side as well versus just a straight HRV, which will help bring down the indoor air quality for the front of the house. That's definitely a longer term investment. Most of the restaurants that are just trying to get open will have to think about this later in time. So we've been talking a lot about how to lay out the restaurant and how seating needs to be to maintain that 6 feet of distance. So one thing we want to consider as well is evaluate the airflow patterns in that space to reduce cross-contamination. The 6 feet rule is there to make sure that there isn't cross-contamination. We want to make sure the HVAC system isn't pushing that air in any way that's, eliminating that 6 foot by pushing the virus around. And then, so with all these things that are being recommended, we're running the HVAC outside of their design parameters. So, I know restaurants are trying to get open. There's a lot of push to get that going on. And it's not the thing to be thinking about right now, but when we add in a MERV 13 filter, they require a higher static loss across the filter. So that's going to affect the HVAC system. Running the fan a lot longer is going to have effects on the HVAC system. Opening up the outside air on the RTU or your handling unit to bring in more outside air needs to happen. How's that going to affect the operation of the system? Your capacity was designed for one level of outside air. Now you're increasing the outside air, your capacity is going to change due to that. So that's another thing to be looking at. And then just again, how the airflow is moving around the space, how everything's working together, how the hood, how we're bringing air between the front of the house to the back of the house through the hood. Kitchens are typically negative. So we're bringing in a little bit of air from the front of the house in there. So there's going to be a little bit of, there's some considerations to have there. Every restaurant's different, so there's going to be different things that need to be looked at. So having your HVAC system evaluated for these updated parameters is going to be a good best of practice to going forward. As we're going to get colder and as people want to move into the more enclosed spaces, as Adam mentioned, people want to feel safe in their spaces. It's going to, you're going to want to try to do everything you can to make them feel as safe in their space. Bringing in as much outside air into the space is the current recommendations to do. The outside air is the best air. So if we can bring in more of that, that's going to help patrons feel a lot safer in the space. And then making sure that the air is not moving across and cross-contamination across other people within the restaurant. So that's, indoor air quality is going to be the thing that we're going to focus in the HVAC world going forward, and how we do that efficiently is also going to be important as well. So those are a little bit long-term thinking on the restaurant side versus, getting open today and, trying to get back to some normalcy in your restaurant.
Thanks, Stephen. Really useful insights on the mechanical side. I'm wondering, based on a couple of things you said, are you seeing some potential conflicts on perhaps manufacturer's warranties or even energy code requirements on things like air changes per hour? Yeah.
So when we talk about ventilation rates, it's always given as a minimum, right? So every ventilation rate you have to meet this minimum. So there's nothing to go above it. Obviously, if you're opening up your outside air greater and you're running it in the winter and you are bringing in more outside air through the heat exchanger for heating, it could crack the heat exchanger, and that would definitely violate the warranty. That's another thing to be evaluated. Once we get into more of the heating seasons, that's going to be something that has to be considered. We don't want to be cracking heat exchangers for gas heating.
Okay, and for the architects listening in, it's we've got some energy targets that we're trying to reach, and this will have to be factored in. It makes it a little bit harder, but it's not a good bad. They're all useful things to target we just need to take it into consideration in our planning of these spaces. One of our participant questions is a good one for you, Stephen, while we're on the topic. Is there a concern with outdoor openings, for example, overhead garage doors with natural breeze entering the space? Do we worry about airborne contaminants?
Yeah, there is a little bit of concern when we're in the outdoors. The air blowing around. There hasn't been a direct correlation about being outdoors and it being passed. Definitely, when you tighten that up into the 6-foot thing and violate that rule, there's been evidence of that happening. But typically, it doesn't happen. But if you're outdoors and it blows indoors, now we're in an enclosed space, and now the dynamics change of the space, and that's something that could happen. I read an article briefly about something that was mentioning that. I mean, if you get a strong enough breeze blowing it into a place, that could be an issue. But yeah, again, it's just picking it up and moving it further through the space, and it is an enclosed space, so it could be trapped at that point.
Okay. Another question we had is, in Colorado, can you take alcoholic beverages outdoors? If so, will beer gardens be a better practice for bars?
So my understanding of this is that the liquor laws are, if you already have a liquor license for your premises and you're expanding your patio into the right of way, you can expand your liquor license into that designated patio space that you're providing on the site plan to the city. If you don't have a liquor license, you're not allowed to just start providing liquor, and you can't take liquor or alcohol outside of the boundary specific to that expansion way. So similar to what's kind of already in place with patios and stuff, you can't take it outside of that boundary.
Okay. So really not a big change from what people are currently operating under.
No,
they'll push more of their capacity. Frank mentioned this too. A lot of restaurants are looking at the outdoor space to get back to the capacity levels they had before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's the same understanding I have. If they close those streets, then that becomes somewhat of like an entertainment block. I think then drinks can maybe be carried around in that area, but still restricted.
Yeah. Frank, in your conversations with some of these local jurisdictions on outdoor space in the right of way, there's a question on expanded dining within parallel parking. Are ADA guidelines involved in the permitting process? How is the circulation from the top of the curb to the street addressed?
That's a good question. I think we kind of struggle a little bit with that too, exactly what kind of options there are to get down there. And, from our understanding, we filed a couple so far, and I think there hasn't really been a comment on that. But, I think there are ramp options that you can do that's fairly makeshift, or just going down to the end of the block and going to the curb cuts for sidewalks. There hasn't really been that much feedback from what I've seen. And Kevin, you may have seen a little bit too with your applications, but TBD, I think.
Yeah, Kevin, Denver or Boulder on that?
Yeah, Boulder is saying as part of their application, they have a check mark that says 75% of the new seating has to be accessible.
Okay.
So there's no going, in theory, down a curb or something like that unless you have a path.
I wonder if Denver's looking at this. This is in the code commentary. It's not in the specific IBC code book, but the code commentary talks about bar seating and how bar seating is not necessarily accessible. But if you're providing similar seating adjacent to the bar seating that provides the same services, then you could get away with having your bar height at 42 inches. So I wonder if maybe they're looking at it the same way. And you have to provide 5% of your seating as wheelchair accessible seating for any restaurant. So I think if you're maintaining that 5% still, then you're probably okay.
And I do want to point out that a lot of the things that have been issued by the state and even the local level have used terms such as guidelines, considerations, and recommendations. So they're not meant to, it does beg the question of how enforcement will look. But a lot of it's taken care of on the upfront stage with applications and permitting. But there's still zoning requirements. There's still the public health guidelines for food service establishments. So I don't believe these will supersede any of those or replace them. It's just things to keep in mind as an operator and as people who assist those operators. And it's probably the case that the locals can exceed whatever are in those state guidelines. And I know some of our task force members have seen that as well. So just something to keep in mind, and you guys can expand on that if you have more thoughts. I want to maybe end with this question from an attendee. If these guidelines were made permanent, how would that affect the real estate requirements for restaurant spaces? So specific to real estate requirements, but I think it's probably a larger question about the future of restaurant design.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. If this sticks around, I mean, it's the cost per square footage of those spaces is going to have to go down tremendously for restaurateurs to make it the numbers. You know, they look at how many seats they could get in a space and what kind of percentage of profit they can make off of those seats. And so that's why when we're typically designing restaurants, you're trying to cram as many seats in the space as possible, so that way they can make the most money. And so if this sticks around, it's gonna drastically affect how and where restaurants are located. It's gonna, potentially become more of a destination where you are traveling to it, and it's not so much in an area where retail or rents costs are super high. They might to be going to places that are further out where they could find a rent that's lower, so they could justify the cost of opening a space that has half the seats that they would have in a space that's smaller in a higher cost per square foot lease. And so it'll be interesting to see. I think all this is going to pass. Like I said, once a vaccine is provided, whoever knows how long that's going to be, but things will get back to normal. It's just, how do we deal with it in the interim, and what best practices can we take from this and integrate those into the I guess of going out to restaurants. It's the theater of dining, right? And so it's that process of how you enter a restaurant, how you engage a restaurant. And so I think as more people have more options and get used to having these takeout options, there's got to be something that is specific that drives them out to a space, the safety of it, the theater of it, the experience of it. And so restaurateurs are going to have to start thinking more creatively, and that's, I think, where architects can come in and help.
Another change I kind of foresee is the introduction of a lot more ghost kitchens. So people who had sort of small restaurants before with a minimal number of seatings may just go to an even smaller space and operate on a takeout only model to save their costs on staff, basically, in order to make their food program work.
Yeah, which we're already seeing anyways as a trend. So yeah, this is only going to fortify that.
There might be some improvements that we make to, I know, Stephen, you mentioned, if you have a well-placed UV array, that could bring down that risk level to a sizable extent where people do feel comfortable being in those spaces.
Yeah, I think, in the future in all buildings, indoor air quality is going to be a bigger issue than it is right now. I mean, LEED and the other things always want you to increase the outside air as it is for their certifications. Just across the board, we're going to see changes within the code. Code takes time to adapt, but if we can be early adopters on a lot of things and provide better indoor air quality into our spaces, occupants will have a better interaction with the building, which is always a good thing. So I think across the board, we'll see indoor air quality become much more important going forward for various reasons. And then, bringing in more indoor air or outside air into the indoor air and trying to increase that quality of air is going to be energy intensive. And how we do that is going to be, it's going to be a bigger issue in how to make that happen. So it's, from an HVAC standpoint, there's a lot of, it's an uncertain time, but there's also a lot of challenges, and it's going to be kind of fun to work through a lot of this stuff. So.
Yeah, it's the occupancy rate in places like offices, you can change that for physical distancing and probably not significantly changed the feel of how that works. This is a different animal. You know, the density in these facilities is part of the experience. And so it's going to be a delicate balance that we try and figure out as a profession along with our client partners to get to, whether it's on a temporary basis until there is a vaccine or mitigation factors that can be widely adopted. It's hard to say what the other side is going to look like, but we know we'll be there to help people figure it out, and we look forward to the day when it does feel like it used to, when we're all enjoying the space together and giving out more awards to people like you for designing those great spaces. I want to thank you guys for joining us today and sharing what you had to share. I hope the attendees benefited from it. And before we go, I do want to point out that this is, as I mentioned earlier, part of a larger task force. So you're seeing a few members of that task force. Just want to mention quickly some of the other members that have volunteered to do this. Ken Andrews, Brent Forget, Kaylin Kirby, and David Riggs have also been part of this effort. And those graphic images that were brought up, we're going to make those available, crowdsource some of that content so that you can use those templates as you work with your clients. And we will stay tuned on where those will be. They will probably be, I don't want to speak out of turn, but I would guess they will be on our COVID-19 resources page for members that is on the AIA Colorado website. And of course, we'll continue to develop those as regulations change and guidance is updated as we go forward. So thanks again, everybody, for participating. If you have not yet put your name in the queue in the chat function, do that, and we'll be sure to get your full credit for HSW on this session today. And we'll see you next week with the sessions that we have planned in the future. Thanks again, and have a good rest of the week.